Aquatic Ecology Notes. This is video 2 of 3. And I'm going to skip ahead to where we left off last time. So we did all the freshwater stuff. And now we're in the marine stuff, which is the saltwater stuff. So we're going to start with estuaries. Okay, so an estuary is a partially enclosed area, coastal water, where seawater mixes with freshwater. This is an area that has to have some kind of river or something feeding into it. It has to have some kind of protection, like geographic or geologic protection, so like it's shallower water or it's surrounded by land, it's got a barrier island, some kind of land formation that separates it, sets it apart from the rest of the ocean. And so you have this semi-enclosed area. All of those factors combine to make it a really great place to hang out, to live for an aquatic or for a marine animal. It means that it's shallower water, it's warmer water, the salinity with that fresh water coming in is a little bit lower, although it's not low enough to be terminated as brackish. It's a little bit lower salinity, and there's usually a lot more nutrients because you have all the nutrients in those rivers coming out and dumping into it as well. So this ends up being a great high biodiversity area for a lot of different species. Salt marshes can be found inside an estuary. Salt marsh is very similar to a freshwater marsh. It's just salty water. So it's flooded by the tide. The key to remember in a salt marsh is that it's a breeding ground, incredibly important as a nursery ecosystem to a lot of animals. So you have to make sure that there's all these animals that come in, lay eggs, give birth, offspring hang out for a while in there until they get big enough and strong enough to make it in the open ocean. Mangrove forests, these are really cool. These are also coastal. They're only found in tropical areas, and they're only found where there's a muddy substrate as opposed to a sandy substrate. So the dominant plant life are these trees called mangrove trees. There's 55 different species. And you can see that the root system is really extensive in these trees and above ground as opposed to underground. So that helps them to avoid rotting from all of that water all the time. So they also have incredibly high biodiversity, lots and lots of different species, tons of stuff hanging out. Also a very important breeding ground for a lot of species. So all of these coastal areas, a lot of organisms will come in and give birth, lay their eggs there, and then have the offspring hang out there for a while. They're also very common for bird species, very, very high bird area, bird biodiversity, especially for the shore birds. Okay, so estuaries financially are a very big investment. Remember that they filter all the water coming in, so all of that grass, all of that plant, vegetation, and everything, all of that sediment filters the water coming in from the river before it hits the ocean. So you end up with a huge waste management, a natural waste management system, and then the recreation, the tourism, and the fisheries all account for a significant amount of money. So when you compare that even to, like the farmland where you're raising crops, there's a lot more money involved in these types of places. Everglades is our case study for this. I would encourage you guys to go look at some pictures and some maps of the Everglades. If you look at a map of the Everglades, it's down here at the tip of Florida on the Gulf side. And very near and dear to my heart, this is where my husband proposed. So we were on a kayak trip through the Everglades. It was really cool. I'll try to bring in some pictures. But huge biodiversity, incredibly important ecosystem. It is a national park. The problem is that Miami is developing, is constantly trying to push west and expand that much more, and so therefore wants to drain it and wants to develop it. And then there's a conservationist that will say, no, we have to keep this a national park. We have to keep it as it is. So there's that debate with the Everglades. The restoration, water-related restoration projects now are, a couple of big trends that you see is building aqueducts, protecting it under Endangered Species Act, and finding other sources of fresh water. So building aqueducts is, what you see here, literally building a tunnel just for water to move, to transport water to where you need that fresh water. Draining or drilling for water, digging for water, using desalinization, like using ocean water that's been desalinated and treated. Other sources of fresh water is becoming more and more popular. and then protecting it as you would any other natural resource, and then even putting it under the Endangered Species Act because it is essential to so many animals. Is all trends for this point in time. Groundwater, a couple of definitions here to give you. Aquifers are porous rock, water moving through it. So that's like a holding cell for a whole bunch of fresh water. The water table is the level, what depth to which the aquifer is filled. And then the renewability is the circulation rate of the groundwater. Okay, so the water usage, 4 main types of water usage that we see on a regular basis. We see the domestic, where your drinking water, your bath water, your dishwater, your laundry, and municipal, again, all of those things at a municipal level, and then the sewage treatment. All of those are the domestic and the municipal sources. We see a huge water use in irrigation for watering crops, and we also see a big water use in industry where we use water as a coolant to fuel a whole bunch of like power plants and chemical processes and stuff like that. Okay, so the problems, if there's too much water, you see flooding, pollution, sewage seeping into the ground, a lot of just increased bacteria, increased grossness, kind of. So you see a lot of problems there with the too much water. With not enough water, this is where it comes into the drought and the desertification, and this is in areas especially where we are digging into the aquifers to get the water, is where you see that desertification. So overdrawing surface water, if we're talking just about the surface water pulling from lakes, rivers, streams, obviously the first thing that you would see is a drop in the water level. If you compare that, then you would see that the recreation use drops because people aren't going to go drive their boats in a pond, they're going to drive their boats in a lake. The fisheries drop, so the tourism and all of that money income drops. The species itself drops because their habitat is being lost. And then you also see salinization, where the increase in the minerals in the ground and everything with less water, their percentage becomes higher, so you see salinization increasing. That Soviet Union Aral Sea is in page 305 in your text. Roundabout in there, that might be an old page number. But if you can't find it, just Google it. These are satellite pictures of it where they drained that river that led into the lake, and now you see just a drastic change in the biodiversity, the human use of the lake. It's a huge problem. Aquifer depletion, where you're draining or digging for water, is ending up harming endangered species because you're not getting that fresh water source coming in, and so it's becoming more and more salty, and a lot of those critters that live in those really unusual habitats and are endangered are becoming more and more threatened. Salinization of irrigated soils. So this is when we're taking the water and we're fertilizing our crops. The water either evaporates or is absorbed by the plant or the land or whatever. But over time, no water is absolutely pure, especially what we're putting on our crops. So over time, you have more and more nutrients left just on the land, salt and minerals left on the land, and that means that after time, nothing will grow there because you just essentially are dumping salt onto the soil. Okay, so the problems in the U.S. Surface water problems is the Mississippi River first. Way too many nutrients, the phosphorus and the nitrogen is the two biggest. So this is a non-point source pollution problem. We cannot point to the source of the pollution. We can't point to this specific farmer and say, hey, this is all your fault, you need to fix this, because it's a whole bunch of people. It's a cumulative effect. And there's nothing, there's no markers. They're all using the same fertilizer, they're all using the same stuff, so you can't tell exactly where it came from. But the Mississippi River, with so many nutrients in it, has ended up dumping into the Gulf, and so now there's this huge dead zone in the Gulf because there's so many nutrients being dumped into the Mississippi River. In the Erie Canal, they built this Erie Canal that connects the ocean to the Great Lakes. Great plan because now boats can travel across. Bad plan because now lampreys and a whole bunch of other stuff came in and are killing all the fish stocks. Zebra mollusk came in on boats, on bilge water and boats. And also a problem in the Great Lakes where they're sucking up all the algae, and so the clarity in the Great Lakes has improved dramatically. It's like 100-foot visibility because there's no algae in there, but then that's the bottom of the food chain is that algae, so that messes up and the fish are all dying. Mono Lake is an example of the salinization, so you had this beautiful lake, if you see this here on the left, that they drained to get fresh water, and now you have like the Dead Sea, pretty much, with that huge salt concentration. The Colorado River Basin, they're building a lot of dams and reservoirs to feed all those areas listed. This is not quite as bad because they're not damming or building a reservoir that blocks the entire water source. So it's a little bit better than what they were talking about on that Blue Gold documentary, in that, yes, it is damaging to the environment, but it's not just totally destructive to the environment because they're letting some of the water pass, or most of the water pass, in which case most stuff can still continue. So not great, but not the end of the world. Going back, it's a good compromise between conservation and industry. So groundwater problems, the same problems as the surface water: pollution, salt, and too much drainage. The big example that you should remember your case study is the Ogallala Aquifer, largest aquifer that we know of, and it's pretty much in the middle of the U.S. It goes from South Dakota to Texas. Remember, an aquifer is underneath the ground, so this is groundwater that we can't see, but it's there. It's this huge aquifer, huge reservoir of fresh water from the last ice age. But remember that it's a really, really slow recharge rate, so essentially we should be counting this as a non-renewable resource because it's definitely not going to renew itself even within our grandchildren's lifetimes. This is like thousands of years to renew itself. So we're pumping water out 8 to 10 times faster than it's able to be renewed, which means that we're going to have a quarter of the stock depleted by 2020. Okay, and I'm going to stop there.